A crisis hollowed out entire societies. Millions trapped in dependency. Cities struggling to function. Governments spending billions every year just to contain the damage, not solve it. In some countries, life expectancy fell, crime surged. Communities collapsed, and decade after decade, the problem only grew. Then one country did what the rest of the world said couldn't be done. Not slowly, not partially, not with endless debates and half measures. China ended the crisis, while much of the West still fights the same battle today. This is the story of how China stopped a social disaster that crippled Western nations and the extreme system it built to do it. By the late 20th century, drug addiction had become one of the most expensive and destructive problems in Western society. In the United States alone, tens of millions struggle with substance dependence. Overdose deaths climb year after year. Entire regions were hollowed out by opioids, methamphetamine, and heroin. Governments poured hundreds of billions into healthcare, policing, courts, prisons, and rehabilitation programs. Yet despite all of it, the crisis never truly ended. Treatment centers cycled people in and out. Arrests filled jails without stopping supply. New drugs replaced old ones. The problem adapted faster than the system fighting it. By the 2010s, overdose deaths in the U.S. surpassed deaths from car accidents and gun violence combined. In parts of Europe, addiction rates remained stubbornly high despite decades of public health campaigns. The West wasn't winning. It was managing decline. China faced the same danger, and in some periods, far worse. After economic reforms in the late 1970s and 1980s opened China to global trade, new trafficking routes exploded across its borders. Heroin flowed in from Southeast Asia. Synthetic drugs spread rapidly through booming cities. Addiction rose fast, particularly among young factory workers, truck drivers, and migrant laborers. By the early 1990s, Chinese authorities were registering hundreds of thousands of drug users officially, and many more unofficially. Smuggling networks expanded across Yunnan, Guangdong, and coastal hubs. Crime linked to drugs surged. For a brief moment, China appeared to be headed toward the same slow-burning disaster unfolding across the West. But instead of treating the crisis as a permanent social condition, Chinese leadership framed it as a direct threat to national stability. Not a health problem alone, not a criminal issue alone, but a systemic risk, one capable of undermining productivity, public order, and political legitimacy. And once it was defined that way, the response changed completely. Where Western governments built fragmented systems, courts here, clinics there, police somewhere else, China built a single unified campaign. Every level of the state moved at once. Production, trafficking, addiction, all targeted simultaneously. The first pillar was supply. China didn't just chase dealers after drugs reached the streets. It went after the entire pipeline. Border regions were flooded with security forces. Smuggling corridors were mapped and dismantled. Surveillance expanded across ports, highways, and freight hubs. Major trafficking rings weren't slowly investigated for years. They were crushed in waves. Large seizures were followed by immediate prosecutions. Organizers faced the harshest penalties available under Chinese law. Networks collapsed faster than they could rebuild. At the same time, local governments were held directly responsible for drug levels in their jurisdictions. If trafficking increased in your province, your career suffered. If addiction fell, you were rewarded. Suddenly, every mayor, police chief, and party official had a personal stake in results. The second pillar was social control. Communities weren't passive observers. Neighborhood committees tracked residents. Schools monitored students. Work units reported suspicious behavior. Families were pressured to intervene early. Drug use wasn't hidden in private. It became visible. And visibility meant immediate response. Those identified as users were registered, monitored, and sent into mandatory treatment programs. Some entered medical detox centers. Others were sent to labor rehabilitation facilities where daily structure replaced addiction routines. It was strict, often harsh, but it was consistent. No revolving door. No disappearing into the streets. The third pillar was deterrence. public trials, public sentencing, media coverage that left no ambiguity about consequences. Major traffickers weren't portrayed as misunderstood figures of poverty. They were framed as threats to society. The message was simple. Drugs were an attack on the nation, and the state would respond without hesitation. Within a few years, the results were dramatic. Seizures skyrocketed while street availability dropped. Registered addiction numbers fell sharply. Crime tied to drugs declined across major cities. Entire trafficking corridors went quiet. By the early 2000s, China had reversed what looked like the beginning of a Western-style addiction spiral. The crisis had not disappeared entirely, but it had been pushed down to a fraction of its former scale. Where the West saw generational collapse, China saw containment and reversal. And this was only the beginning of the system they would build to keep it that way. Because China wasn't aiming for management. It was aiming for eradication. What made China's campaign different wasn't just severity. It was coordination. In most Western countries, drug policy was split across agencies that rarely moved in unison. Health departments focused on treatment. Police focused on arrests. Courts processed cases slowly. Politicians shifted strategy every election cycle. The result was a permanent gap between cause and consequence. China closed that gap. Once a trafficking route was discovered, enforcement moved immediately. When users were identified, treatment followed at once. When communities showed rising numbers, leadership changed. There was no waiting for annual budgets, no years-long reform debates, no separation between policy and execution. Everything happened together. One of the most powerful tools was what officials called responsibility contracts. Local governments were given clear targets: reduce addiction rates, eliminate known dealers, shut down smuggling channels, meet the numbers or face demotion, investigation, or removal. Success brought promotions. Failure ended careers. Suddenly, every official had incentive to act aggressively. Police departments weren't rewarded for making arrests. They were rewarded for making the problem disappear. Entire task forces were created to track drug flows in real time. Informants were encouraged. Financial records were analyzed. Transportation companies were monitored. Hotels, warehouses, and shipping hubs were inspected continuously. Traffickers couldn't simply move to the next neighborhood. The net followed them. At the borders, China reinforced already strict customs operations. Advanced scanning equipment was deployed at ports. Patrols increased along mountain crossings and river routes. Cooperation with neighboring countries expanded to intercept shipments before they entered Chinese territory. In provinces like Yunnan, once notorious as gateways for heroin from Southeast Asia, authorities dismantled entire smuggling networks that had operated for decades. What the West often treated as a law enforcement challenge, China treated as a national security threat. And threats were handled with overwhelming force. But enforcement alone wasn't enough. China understood something many Western systems struggled to accept. Addiction thrives in chaos, unemployment, and social instability. So while cracking down on supply, the state moved just as aggressively to restructure daily life for those caught in addiction. Mandatory rehabilitation wasn't simply detox. It was total routine replacement. Users woke up at fixed hours. They worked full days. They ate regular meals. They attended education sessions on health, law, and employment skills. They slept on schedule. The goal was to rebuild discipline and social attachment at the same time physical dependence was broken. For some, treatment occurred in medical facilities. For others, especially repeat users, it happened in labor rehabilitation centers. These facilities were controversial. They were strict, highly controlled, demanding, but they eliminated the instability that often sent Western patients straight back to drugs. There was no returning to the same street corner, no falling back into the same social circle, no idle time. By the time individuals left the system, their habits, environment, and routine had been fundamentally altered. At the community level, prevention became constant. Schools ran mandatory drug education programs from early grades. Employers conducted regular screenings in sensitive industries. Neighborhood committees visited households where risk was identified. Drug use wasn't a hidden personal struggle. It was treated as a social issue everyone had responsibility to stop. Contrast that with much of the West. There, privacy protections often prevented early intervention. Treatment was voluntary and easily abandoned. Police released repeat offenders back into the same environment within days. The system was built to process addiction, not remove it. China's system was built to break it. The numbers reflected the difference. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, official reports showed registered drug users falling significantly in many regions. Seizure volumes rose sharply at first, a sign of aggressive enforcement, then began dropping as supply chains collapsed. Urban crime tied to narcotics declined. Public drug markets disappeared from major cities. Entire neighborhoods, once known for trafficking, were transformed. By the time China entered the new millennium, the looming crisis that had threatened to mirror Western addiction epidemics had been pushed back. Not managed, reversed, and the campaign didn't stop. Authorities continued refining surveillance systems. Data sharing between police, healthcare providers, and local governments expanded. New synthetic drugs were tracked as soon as they appeared. Whenever usage began rising in a region, enforcement surged immediately. There was no tolerance for slow growth. The philosophy was simple: act early, act forcefully, never allow momentum to build. Meanwhile, Western nations continued cycling through strategies. One decade emphasized punishment. The next emphasized treatment, then harm reduction, then legalization debates. Each shift brought temporary improvements in one area while worsening another. Addiction adapted, supply adapted. The crisis evolved faster than policy. By the 2020s, opioid overdoses in the United States alone were killing tens of thousands every year. New synthetic drugs made enforcement harder. Communities once again faced collapse in public health systems. What China had crushed, the West continued to struggle to contain. And this contrast revealed a deeper truth about how societies confront systemic crises. One treated the problem as permanent. The other treated it as unacceptable. And that difference shaped everything that followed. But suppression alone does not explain the scale of the reversal. The deeper shift happened beneath the surface. China did not just tighten enforcement. It reshaped the environment that had allowed addiction to spread in the first place. In the 1990s, rapid economic growth had created enormous internal migration. Millions moved from rural provinces into manufacturing hubs along the coast. Young workers left villages, families, and traditional social structures behind. In unfamiliar cities, far from support networks, vulnerability increased. Drug traffickers exploited that instability. The state responded by accelerating something else: integration. Work units, residential registration systems, and local party committees were strengthened in urban districts experiencing rising drug cases. Migrant workers were gradually brought into more formal employment records. Housing oversight increased. Social insurance programs expanded. The message was subtle but clear. If you were part of the system would monitor you, but it would also provide structure. Where Western societies often separated personal liberty from social supervision, China blurred that boundary. Stability was prioritized over privacy. Prevention was prioritized over autonomy. For critics, this approach raised serious concerns about civil liberties. For officials, it was proof that prevention worked only when it was constant. At the same time, economic reforms continued pulling millions into steady employment. Industrial growth provided wages. Urbanization created opportunity. The state invested heavily in infrastructure, manufacturing zones, and public works. Addiction thrives in stagnation. China chose expansion. As legitimate economic opportunity widened, the space for large-scale drug markets narrowed. That contrast became sharper when comparing outcomes across the Pacific. In parts of the United States, deindustrialization hollowed out entire towns. Factories closed. Jobs vanished. Public health systems struggled to respond. Pharmaceutical opioids flooded communities already facing unemployment and social isolation. The numbers climbed relentlessly. By 2017, opioid overdoses were killing more than 47,000 Americans per year. Synthetic fentanyl accelerated the crisis further. Entire regions faced rising homelessness, strained emergency rooms, and overloaded courts. In Europe, while the scale differed, similar patterns emerged. Heroin waves in the 1990s were followed by synthetic drug markets in the 2000s. Policy debates swung between harm reduction and criminalization. Each country tried different balances, yet addiction remained persistent. Meanwhile, in China, official statistics showed drug user registration stabilizing and then declining through the early 2000s. Large urban centers that once feared open-air markets saw them disappear. Public messaging reinforced the transformation. State media repeatedly framed drug control as part of national rejuvenation. Campaigns emphasized discipline, collective responsibility, and vigilance. The crisis was no longer described as an unfortunate social trend. It was described as something defeated. And once a problem is framed as defeated, allowing it to return becomes politically unacceptable. China's system therefore evolved into continuous suppression. Periodic national anti-drug campaigns were launched with renewed intensity. Provinces were inspected. Data was reviewed. Weak enforcement zones were corrected. Technology added new layers. Digital monitoring systems tracked chemical precursor sales. Online activity connected to drug distribution was flagged quickly. Facial recognition and expanded CCTV networks increased the ability to identify suspects in public spaces. What had once required months of investigation could now be mapped in days. The Western debate often asked a different question. At what point does enforcement infringe on individual freedom? China asked another. At what point does tolerance allow systemic decay? These opposing priorities shape entirely different outcomes. The Western model sought balance. China sought elimination. Even the rehabilitation philosophy diverged further over time. In many Western systems, relapse is treated as expected. Multiple attempts at recovery are normal. Harm reduction strategies aim to reduce fatalities rather than remove usage entirely. China's framework maintained a stricter stance. Relapse triggered renewed intervention. Supervision could extend. Community oversight intensified. The approach assumed that allowing a drug market to persist at manageable levels would eventually allow it to expand again, so manageable levels were not accepted. The visible effects were measurable. Public drug scenes common in major Western cities did not reappear in Chinese urban centers at similar scale. Drug-related homicide remained comparatively low. Large synthetic opioid waves that devastated North America never reached the same magnitude inside China. That did not mean drugs vanished completely. No country eradicates demand entirely. But the scale difference mattered. Where Western nations faced generational trauma tied to addiction, China limited it to controlled pockets. And perhaps most important of all, the political consensus around drug suppression never fractured. There were no competing state-level policies pulling in opposite directions. No referendum cycles reversing enforcement every few years. No polarized debates paralyzing long-term strategy. The policy was centralized, sustained, reinforced. Over time, this consistency reshaped public expectations. Young generations in China grew up with drug markets largely invisible in daily life. Awareness campaigns framed drug use as both dangerous and socially unacceptable. Community reporting became normalized. In contrast, Western societies increasingly normalized exposure. Harm reduction centers became part of urban infrastructure. News cycles regularly reported overdose statistics as ongoing realities. One model treated the crisis as a war to be won. The other treated it as a chronic condition to be managed. And that philosophical divide continued widening the gap between outcomes. By the time 2 decades had passed since China's first major modern drug suppression campaigns, the contrast with Western outcomes had become impossible to ignore. One system had bent the crisis downward. The other had watched it multiply. China's approach was never gentle. It relied on surveillance, compulsory treatment, relentless enforcement, and political pressure from the highest levels of government down to neighborhood committees. It accepted social control as the price of social stability. And in doing so, it achieved something few believed possible. A rapidly growing drug epidemic was contained. Trafficking networks were dismantled again and again. Public addiction was pushed out of everyday life. Generations were largely shielded from the scale of devastation seen elsewhere. The West chose a different path. Individual rights remained paramount. Enforcement shifted constantly. Treatment systems operated in isolation from economic policy. Political polarization fractured long-term strategy. Each reform addressed one symptom while leaving the structure intact. The result was a crisis that evolved instead of ending. When prescription opioids were restricted, illicit heroin surged. When heroin was disrupted, fentanyl replaced it. When fentanyl overwhelmed communities, new synthetic compounds followed. The market adapted faster than institutions. And the human toll climbed year after year. This does not mean China's model came without costs. Civil liberties were narrowed. Surveillance became pervasive. The state gained immense power over daily life. Rehabilitation often blurred into punishment. Dissent against policy was limited. The system worked precisely because it tolerated little resistance. Where Western democracies emphasized consent and individual autonomy, China emphasized compliance and collective outcomes. One prioritized freedom, the other prioritized stability. And when confronting a systemic social threat, those priorities produced radically different results. China demonstrated that addiction at national scale is not inevitable. It is not an unstoppable force of modern life. It is a problem shaped by incentives, enforcement, social structure, and political will. When every layer of society is aligned toward elimination, the crisis can be driven down. When responses remain fragmented, temporary, and constantly contested, the crisis persists. The deeper lesson extends far beyond drugs. It reveals how societies confront threats that emerge from rapid economic change. Some systems move slowly, constrained by debate, legal complexity, and competing values. Others mobilize quickly, coordinating institutions toward a single outcome. Neither approach is without risk. Unchecked state power can suppress freedom. Unchecked social collapse can hollow out nations. China chose control. The West chose pluralism. And in this crisis, control proved far more effective at producing immediate results. Today, China continues to maintain aggressive drug surveillance and enforcement. New substances are tracked as soon as they appear. Digital monitoring expands. Rehabilitation remains compulsory when needed. The crisis never fully disappears, but it never regains momentum. In much of the West, overdose deaths remain at historic highs. Communities continue struggling with cycles of addiction, homelessness, and overwhelmed healthcare systems. Policymakers debate reforms while the underlying structure remains fractured. Two different philosophies. Two different outcomes. China's campaign shows what happens when a state treats a social crisis as an existential threat and mobilizes total institutional force to eliminate it. The Western experience shows what happens when societies attempt to manage that same crisis within fragmented systems built for individual freedom rather than collective control. Neither model offers an easy answer. But together, they reveal a truth often ignored. Crisis is not only a matter of resources, it is a matter of structure. In the end, China did not stop addiction through mercy, moderation, or slow reform. It stopped it through coordination, compulsion, and relentless pressure. The West did not fail for lack of compassion or spending. It struggled because its systems were never designed for total mobilization. And that difference reshaped millions of lives. One society bent the curve downward. The other continues to chase it. How nations confront systemic threats will define their stability in the decades ahead, not just in public health, but in economics, technology, and social cohesion. The story of China's drug suppression campaign is not simply about addiction. It is about power, about structure, about what happens when a society decides a crisis is no longer acceptable, and what happens when it does not. If you found this breakdown insightful, The next story, already waiting for you, explores another moment when a nation reshaped its future through systemic force. Thanks for watching.